Before the Fellowship was the greatest story you've never heard. I'm Dan.
I'm Cameron.
I'm Greg.
Join us as we read and react to the Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. Last time we continued Akallabeth, the downfall of Númenor. Sauron had risen to power in Mordor and sought to rule as a god unto men. In the time that the One Ring was forged, Tar-Palantir and the Númenoreans allied themselves with the Eldar and fought against Mordor. Shadow continued to spread in Númenor as kings grew further aloof from the elves. The faithful Elendil were slowly pushed out of Númenor. The lords of Andúril were a special line directly from Elros who loved the Eldar and were once revered by the kings of Númenor, but now operated secretly, attempting to amend the hearts of the kings with wise counsel. Tar-Palantir ascended to the throne, and he tended again to the White Tree, prophesying that the fate of the tree was tied to the Númenoreans. But his attempts to amend the relationship between Númenor and Valinor failed. His nephew, Ar-Pharazón, the Golden, becomes king of Númenor. He was angered by Sauron's growing power and marched into Middle-earth to confront Sauron. Sauron, seeing that the Númenorians had grown strong, surrendered himself. He was taken to Númenor as a prisoner. Today, we continue Akallabeth, beginning on page 271 of the second edition. Yet such was the cunning of his mind and mouth, and the strength of his hidden will, that ere 3 years had passed, he had become closest to the secret counsels of the king. For flattery sweet as honey was ever on his tongue, and knowledge he had of many things yet unrevealed to men. And seeing the favour that he had of their lord, all the counsellors began to fawn upon him, save one alone, Amandil, lord of Andúril. Then slowly a change came over the land, and the hearts of the elf friends were sorely troubled, and many fell away out of fear. And although those that remained still called themselves the faithful, their enemies named them rebels. For now, having the ears of men, Sauron with many arguments gainsayed all that the Valar had taught, and he bade men to think that in the world, in the east, and even in the west, there lay yet many seas and many lands for their winning, wherein was wealth uncounted. And still, if they should at last come to the end of those lands and seas, beyond all lay the ancient darkness. And out of it the world was made, for darkness alone is worshipful, and the Lord thereof may yet make other worlds to be gifts of those that serve them, so that the increase of their power shall find no end. And Ar-Pharazón said, "Who is the Lord of darkness?" Then behind locked doors, Sauron spoke to the king, and he lied, saying, "It is he whose name is now not spoken, for the Valar have deceived you concerning him, putting forth the name of Eru, a phantom devised in the folly of their hearts, seeking to enchain men in the servitude to themselves, for they are the oracle of this Eru, which speaks only what they will. But he that is their master shall yet prevail, and he will deliver you from this phantom. And his name is Melkor, Lord of all, giver of freedom, and he shall make you stronger than they." Then Ar-Pharazón, the king, turned back to the worship of the dark, and of Melkor the lord thereof, at first in secret, but ere long openly, and in the face of his people. And they for the most part followed him. Yet there dwelt still a remnant of the faithful, as has been told, at Romena, and in a country near, and other few there were here and there in the land. The chief among them, to whom they looked for leading and courage in evil days, was Amandil, counselor of the king, and his son Elendil, whose sons were Isildur and Anarion. Then young men by the reckoning of Númenor, Amandil and Elendil were great ship captains, and they were of the line of Elros Tar-Miniator, though not of the ruling house to whom belonged the crown and the throne in the city of Armenelos. In the days of their youth together, Amandil had been dear to Ar-Pharazón, and though he was of the elf friends, he remained in his council until the coming of Sauron. Now, he was dismissed, for Sauron hated him above all others in Númenor. But he was so noble, and had been so mighty a captain of the sea, that he was still held in honor by many of the people, and neither the king nor Sauron dared to lay hands on him as yet. Therefore Amandil withdrew to Romena, and all that he trusted still to be faithful he summoned to come thither in secret, for he feared that evil would now grow apace, and all the elf friends were in peril. And so it came to pass, for the Meneltarmar was most deserted in those days, and though not even Sauron dared to defile the high place, yet the king, who would let no man, upon pain of death, ascend to it, not even those of the faithful who kept Ilúvatar in their hearts. And Sauron urged the king to cut down the white tree, Nimloth the fair, that grew in his courts, for it was a memorial of the Eldar and of the light of Valinor. At the first, the king would not assent to this, since he believed that the fortunes of his house were bound up with this tree, as was forspoken by Tar-Palantir. Thus, in his folly, he now hated the Eldar, and the Valar vainly clung to the shadow of the old allegiance of Númenor. But when Amandil heard rumour of the evil purpose of Sauron, he was grieved to the heart, knowing that in the end Sauron surely would have his will. Then he spoke to Elendil, and the sons of Elendil, recalling the tale of the trees of Valinor. And Isildur said no word, but went out by night, and did a deed for which he was afterwards renowned. For he passed alone in disguise to Armenelos, and to the courts of the king, which were now forbidden to the faithful. And he came to the place of the tree, which was forbidden to all by the orders of Sauron. And the tree was watched day and night by guards in his service. At the time Nimloth was dark and bore no bloom, for it was late in the autumn, and its winter was nigh. And Isildur passed through the guards, and took from the tree a fruit that was hung upon it, and turned to go. But the guard was aroused, and he was assailed, and fought his way out, receiving many wounds, and he escaped. And because he was disguised, it was not discovered who had laid hands on the tree. But Isildur came at last hardly back to Romena, and delivered the fruit to the hands of Amandil, ere his strength failed him. Then the fruit was planted in secret, and it was blessed by Amandil, and a shoot arose from it, and sprouted in the spring. But when its first leaf opened, then Isildur, who had lain long and come near to death, arose, and was troubled no more by his wounds. None too soon was this done, for after the assault the king yielded to Sauron, and felled the white tree, and turned then wholly away from the allegiance of his fathers. But Sauron caused to be built upon the hill in the midst of the city of the Númenorians, Armenelos, the golden mighty temple, and it was in the form of a circle at the base, and there were walls 50 feet high in thickness, and the width of the base was 500 feet across from the center, and the walls rose from the ground 500 feet, and they were crowned with a mighty dome. And that dome was roofed, all with silver, and rose glittering in the sun, so that the light of it could be seen afar off. But soon the light was darkened, and the silver came black. For there was an altar of fire in the midst of the temple, and in the topmost of the dome there was a louvre, whence there issued a great smoke. And the first fire upon the altar Sauron kindled with the hewn wood of Nimloth, and it cracked and was consumed. But men marvelled at the reek that went up from it, so that the land lay under a cloud for 7 days, until it went and passed into the west. Thereafter the fire and smoke went up without ceasing, for the power of Sauron daily increased, and in that temple, with spilling of blood and torment and great wickedness, men made sacrifice to Melkor, that he should release them from death. And most often from among the faithful they chose their victims, yet never openly, on the charge that they would not worship Melkor, the giver of freedom. Rather was cause sought against them that they hated the king and were his rebels, or that they plotted against their kin, devising lies and poisons. These charges for the most part were false. Yet those were bitter days, and hate brings forth hate. But for all this death did not depart from the land. Rather it came sooner and more often, and in many dreadful guises. For whereas aforetime men had grown slowly old, and had laid them down in the end to sleep, when they were weary at the last of the world, now madness and sickness assailed them, and yet they were afraid to die out and go into the dark, the realm of the Lord that they had taken, and they cursed themselves into their agony. And men took weapons in those days, and slew one another for little cause, for they were become quick to anger. And Sauron, or those whom he had bound to himself, went about the land, setting man against man, so that the people murmured against the king and the lords, or against any that had aught that they had not, and the men of power took cruel revenge. None the less, for long it seemed to the Númenorians that they prospered, and if they were not increased in happiness, yet they grew more strong, and their rich men ever richer. For with the aid and counsel of Sauron, they multiplied their possessions. And they devised engines, and they built ever greater ships. And they sailed now with power and armory to Middle-earth. And they came no longer as bringer of gifts, nor even as rulers, but as fierce men of war. And they hunted the men of Middle-earth, and took their goods, and enslaved them. And many they slew cruelly upon their altars. For they built in their fortresses temples and great tombs in those days, and men feared them, and the memory of the kindly kings of the ancient faded from the world, and was darkened by many a tale of dread. In summary, Sauron becomes an esteemed counselor to the king of Númenor. He stirs their greed and bids them seek untold riches in the far reaches of the world, including the ancient darkness beyond the edge of the world, where dwells Melkor. Ar-Pharazón and the Númenorians begin worshipping the darkness. Amandil and his son Elendil are part of the faithful and close to Ar-Pharazón. Amandil is hated by Sauron and is dismissed from the council. Sauron urges Ar-Pharazón to cut down the White Tree, but he will not for fear of the prophecy of Tar-Palantir. Suspecting that this will happen in due time, Isildur, son of Elendil, sneaks to the tree and removes a fruit before being assailed by guards. He escapes, and a shoot grows from the fruit. Sauron cuts Nimloth the White Tree, and orders the building of a great temple in Armenelos, in which the tree is burned and sacrifices are made to Melkor that he would release them from death. Mainly the faithful are sacrificed, but death does not depart from the land. Instead, madness and sickness ravage the people. They continue to grow stronger and richer under the counsel of Sauron, and now go into Middle-earth, not as rulers, but to make war on the people there. They slay and sacrifice the men there, and build great temples and tombs. All right. Well, that was quite a interesting reading. We have Sauron managing to kind of strong-arm his way back in through his cunning serpentine words and convincing manipulation. Yeah, what were your thoughts?
Again, I'm intrigued that we're talking about worship so bluntly and openly. You know, the mention of Iluvatar, for example, again. It's interesting that in the Lord of the Rings, they like never mention his name. Last time I read it, don't remember seeing it, but there's something about the land of Númenor and they have this temple that they worship at, that they can speak of Iluvatar openly. But it's in this space and it's in this vulnerable spot where the men of Númenor who, you know, are afraid of death and they're like suspicious of the Eldar. And then it's in this place that Sauron tells them a complete lie about darkness being like the bringer of life. Because he tells them a truth in the sense that outside of all that is, you know, Ea, that is darkness. But he didn't tell them that that's where Iluvatar is, or the secret fire. He says that the darkness is what is worshipful. So I found that really compelling. And evil. Like, it's so evil. It's so much more evil than just like a physical thing you can do, like a slap in the face or like a guillotine or whatever. It's just like blatantly lying in such a deceitful, ruinous way.
It's interesting too, because I agree with what you said, and I highlighted a lot of those parts. But from the perspective of, okay, just like giving the benefit of the doubt to the Númenorians, not that they deserve it, but just to make the point, they just have to take either the Valar's word that Eru Iluvatar is who they say he is, or Sauron's word that he's not. You know, that's one of the lies, right? That Eru isn't really the lord of everything. It's just a name that the Valar are using to have their way.
You know what? I think it's more than that, because it's not just two authorities. It's also the tradition that they've forgotten. So, for example, it's not just the Valar versus Sauron. We find out that Elendil, when he steals the fruit and plants the new tree, he starts, in cultivating this new tree, he starts to recall the tales of the Tree of Valinor. That's at the bottom of 272. So the way I read it is, it wasn't just that the Númenorians started listening to someone else, is they stopped remembering, and they stopped telling their story, and they stopped remembering where they came from. But Elendil kept the story alive, because if you forget where you're from, then you're susceptible to Sauron.
That's a good point.
It's also, I wonder if there's, because he doesn't mention him by name, Sauron.
Mention
wonder
who
if-
by name?
Iluvatar. He just says Eru. I wonder if there's like a cowardice there, a fear of actually speaking the name of the creator, and rather just using a euphemism out of cowardice.
Oh, I thought Eru was one of
Eru, it means the one, but Iluvatar is the name of the one. So it's like the
interesting.
Lord
It's like
versus...
more intimate, personal. Interesting.
Yeah.
Can we fact check that? Discord, can we fact check? Just kidding.
Yeah, what is Iluvatar? Father of all is what it means. So it's father. It's more personal than just the one. It's interesting.
So okay, so Cameron, to your point, you're right that they lost a sense of their tradition. They failed to recall the tales, but they, at the same time too, the Valar are distant from them. So everything that they're hearing from them is kind of secondhand. Like they're friends originally, they're friends to the Eldar, and Elros in particular would know everything about this because his family was involved in the founding of Númenor and all of that, right? But Sauron is right there with them, giving counsel to the king.
Mm-hmm.
So he has their ear in a way that the Valar don't. And you could this isn't in opposition to what you said. This adds to what you said, but this isn't something that just happened out of the blue. They've been down this path for a while now, where they're resisting the Valar. They don't sail into the West anymore. They only go to Middle Earth to pillage, and it's their lust for power that leads them to confronting Sauron. So it's all kind of led down this path. All these things kind of have coalesced to the point where they're doing human sacrifice to Melkor.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the crazy thing is that they're worshiping Melkor. Like that is so dark. You know, it's we've never had such a blatant, like we've had evil in the Lord of the Rings, but never against the first commandment, so to speak, to kind of mix religions and metaphors, you know?
It's interesting because it's clearly an evil, right? It's clearly a deception. It's just a blatant lie. Melkor is, really the one you should be worshiping. He's good, and there's also no excuse, or there's no pass given to the men who follow him for that reason. You contrast that with like C.S. Lewis in The Last Battle. You have this false god in there who they're worshipping, and in the end, Aslan comes to one of these Kalor men and says to him, "Oh, it was me you were worshipping all along. You were just mistaken, and you thought instead it was
a donkey and a lion suit."
What was the name of the false Tash? Yeah, Tash.
It was Tashland, and then it became Tash.
Yeah, Tash. And then he gets to go to heaven because like he was really worshipping. Tolkien doesn't give. He's not concerned with like allegory and like, oh, this is like the Muslims, like he's not concerned about like trying to make a point.
Yeah, right.
So he just shows it for what it is. It's like, no, this is like, there is a deception happening here. It is like nothing but evil. And the evil one in this, Sauron, is using, he's using deceit in order to kind of make people to misdirect their worship to something that is completely evil. It's just an interesting contrast between the two authors, how they handle this subject. And I think Tolkien's probably freer to just write without needing to make a point or prove something, or
if everything means one thing, it's difficult.
Yeah, it kind of like blocks you in. I think we must have read this at some point already, but I recall reading that I guess like Tolkien said something like his original writing of the Lord of the Rings wasn't Catholic necessarily, wasn't like a Catholic story, but then in the editing, he did kind of emphasize some of those things. Like it wasn't intentional in an allegorical sense, but it was just imbued into it because of his worldview. But then in the editing, he saw some of these themes more clearly than when he wrote it, and kind of built some of them, built them up even more. But it is interesting what you say, that there's this freedom to just take it wherever and see what truth kind of comes out of it. If there's, or like if there is something true about the nature of deceit and false worship, it will come out in this story.
Yeah.
No matter what.
Yeah. He doesn't have to nuance it, and he doesn't have to. It's just sort of. It's just what it is. I bet that point though is in here. Sorry, go ahead, Cam.
Yeah, one thing that I thought of, kind of riffing on the idea that what's happening could mean many things. I had an idea, not that Tolkien had this in mind, but here's what it made me think of. The line, when you talk about the ancient darkness, like beyond everything, there's this ancient darkness, and darkness alone being worshipful, and that is what created everything. It kind of reminds me of atheist cosmologists today who talk about this like outside the Big Bang, this nothing that's actually something that created everything, and isn't that amazing? And it's not a personal God. We're doing away with all that, but it's like this darkness that births all life. And I could not make that connection because it sounded like who's that one guy who he wrote the book like A Universe from Nothing. Is it Krauss? Someone like that? I forget his name. Stephen Krauss or something like that. But yeah, one of those atheist cosmologists where without a personal God, you're left with chaos, and chaos being the ultimate thing, and the rule of power and might and, anger and selfishness.
Yeah. So that point, that quote that you were alluding to, which was in the first paragraph of our reading today, at the end of it, it actually doesn't say who's speaking then. It's implied that it might be Sauron. But it also could be something else. I don't know if you guys had any insight to it. So if you go to the middle of the paragraph is where the preceding sentence. For now, having the ears of men, Sauron, with many arguments, gainsaid all the Valar had taught. And he bade men to think that in the world, in the east, and even in the west, there lay yet many seas and many lands for their winning, wherein was wealth uncounted. And still, if they should at last come to the end of those lands and seas, beyond all lay ancient darkness. And then there's this, and then someone's speaking, but we don't know. I don't know if it's Sauron. I don't know if it's Sauron quoting something like a song that is known or an ancient text that is known. It has the ring to me of some kind of pre-written text. And out of it the world was made, for darkness alone is worshipful, and the Lord thereof yet make other worlds to be gifts to those that serve him, so that the increase of their power shall find no end. It almost sounds like it's quoting something that was pre-written. Any thoughts to that? Or do you think it's just Sauron like saying it?
Yeah, I think it's just a literary way to go from Sauron is saying that to here's what Sauron's word for word saying. So he made many arguments, blah, 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 and then you hear one of them.
It's just interesting that it doesn't, like most other places it would have, and then Sauron said, or something to that effect.
Yeah, I think
and it doesn't here. And it's the first time he's spoken as well. It doesn't. Yeah. It's interesting to me.
I
It's just an
didn't even
interesting
notice
piece.
that. At
Yeah.
Is
first.
it okay? I will give you. This is like kind of making an argument from silence, which isn't very helpful, but it sounds like the kind of thing that maybe um, Melkor would have said to Sauron to kind of put him into his service. You know, like you will receive
Yeah.
an increase of power that shall find no end. You know, if you make yourself subservient to me, that kind of thing. You know,
Yeah, right.
which is an interesting theory. It's not like
What the other
in the
interesting
text.
thing is that in this position where Sauron knows he can catch this king in a lie, like deceive him, like this is the moment, he still gives deference to Melkor instead of saying like I am that one, the Lord
Maybe
of
it
all
would have
the
seemed
earth.
too obvious that he wasn't. Like he surrendered to them as a prisoner.
Yeah, there's no like mythos. It's just like
Yeah,
he's just a bro standing there.
yeah.
That makes sense.
I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder why. It's curious why Tolkien chose to. I can see your point, Cameron, of it being just a literary device of like, here's the arguments he made and how he convinced them of this, that, and that, and then it's just him speaking. It's just interesting. It's also very like stark because, like, he manages to convince them that darkness is alone worshipful, and you know, in the Valaquenta, when we hear about Eru the One, we don't get a sense of darkness. We get the sense of light and the secret fire, and so that would have been a part of their mythos, that they would have known of Eru's like brilliance, but not of like a shadow. So it's not like I don't think it's like, oh yeah, oh, so that explains the darkness that we've been worshipping. It's almost like it's a new concept, and he's convinced them of it.
Yeah, I think so. I think I finally agree with you once.
It does. You're right, Dan, to say it does sound like a verse from a dark scripture, like
Yeah.
an evil Bible, right? It's like it has the same kind of cadence of something that would be passed down for centuries. That has strong ideas and imagery in it. Yeah, that is really cool.
It kind of sounds like the fake scripture that Samuel Jackson recites in Pulp Fiction. It's like,
Oh yeah.
but he that is their master shall yet prevail, and he will deliver you from this phantom, and you will know that I am the Lord. The only other point that I had, we could talk about maybe the tree. That's pretty significant, but I wanted to point something out that I thought was interesting, which is this progression that we see in the nature of the worship of the Númenorians. So this is back on page 266. It says this is kind of when they're starting to go down their path away from they lose their trust in the Valar and stuff, right? And it says and they become obsessed with death, right? That's what we read before. It says, but those that live turn the more eagerly to pleasure and revelry, desiring ever more goods and more riches. And after the days of Tar and Kaliman, the offering of the first fruits to Eru was neglected, and men went seldom any more to the hollow upon the heights of Meneltarma in the midst of the land. So that's like the place of worship, right? This peak or this like high place where the temple is, and that's where they offer their first fruits. So it starts with them neglecting to offer the first fruits to Iluvatar. And then it ends with them offering human sacrifice to Melkor. Like there's this big shift, and this is related to what you were saying earlier, Cameron. It's gradual. It starts with neglect. It starts with like mistrust and then neglect. And then they're easily swayed when they're no longer rooted in what has been passed on to them. But I just thought, what an interesting, like it must be clear to some of them, although they probably deny it, that offering first fruits is a very benign like sign of worship or like active worship. Like it's fruits. But human sacrifice is a different kind of sacrifice. It's like categorically different than offering first fruits. So it must be evident to some of them that what they're up to is truly evil. It's not like, oh, this is the true God who's now demanding human sacrifice. Like they know what the true God demanded of them before, but they've gotten so far away from it now.
They lost hope, right? So they're there, and the Númenorians are saying things like, why should we not envy the valor, or at least the deathless, right? They become obsessed with death, and they start orienting everything around escaping death, because they no longer see it as this gift of Iluvatar, but rather some kind of curse. And actually, going back to the darkness thing, which Sauron somehow manages to convince them of, right where you were quoting, right nearby where you were quoting on 266, it says, in their attempts to kind of cheat death, yet they achieved only the art of preserving incorrupt the dead flesh of men, and they filled all the land with silent tombs. So there's that worship element, in which the thought of death was enshrined in the darkness. So the thought of death, like they're kind of containing, like the unknown, the fear, the death in these tombs. But really, it's like they're trying to attempt to break the spell of death, and that's exactly what is being convinced to them by Sauron, that he'll overcome it for them, that Melkor will overcome it for them, and it's
death is not a gift. Yeah, it's wow.
That's how he manages to manipulate them. He freaking Ar-Pharazón. Why did he think that he could overcome Sauron? Come on, dude.
I have one more thought and then I'll shut up. But this is the last paragraph that we read on 274. It begins with, nonetheless, for long it seemed to the Númenorians that they prospered. And if they were not increased in happiness, yet they grew more strong, and their rich men ever richer. Doesn't that sound like us? Kind of like,
oh yeah,
it sounds like our world now, where
oh yeah,
there's just like epidemics of loneliness and depression. But it's like in our postmodern, technologically advanced world, there's just like the rich men ever richer. We're stronger than ever, but not happier.
Yeah, life is survival, not thriving. Life is a weariness. Earlier it mentions, life being reft from their hands. Like, it became a grief to them. They would not yield until life was reft from them. That's how a lot of people live, is like just trying to prolong their lives with comforts and riches. That's how I live.
And the result of it, is depression. I mean, it's in our modern day, it's depression, and this is how Tolkien puts the depression of that day. But for all this, death did not depart from the land. Rather, it came sooner and more often, and in many dreadful disguises. For whereas aforetime men had grown slowly old, and had laid them down in the end to sleep, when they were weary at the last of the world, now madness and sickness assailed them, and they were yet afraid to die and go out into the dark, the realm of the Lord that they had taken, and they cursed themselves in their agony. That's the nihilists. That's nihilism right there.
Yeah.
It's like,
I think one thing that's super interesting to me is sometimes I think this is just this is not like only unique to only me, but I sometimes think that we're just so much worse off than 20 years ago or 50 years ago in many ways as a culture. But I think all these same things were present in Tolkien's day. he saw it expressed in different ways, and the technological limitations and stuff shaped it in certain ways. But it's all there, and the philosophy behind it all was around at that time too. And I'm sure he saw it in the post-war era when, I mean, he lost many friends, and sure, I'm guessing, many that survived were just plagued by nihilism and all these different things, the sickness and the madness.
I think this podcast might have become a grief to our listeners, and it will just go on and on.
Thank you for that reference of on and on. My heart will go on. There we go. That was the reference that I was looking for. Good.
That is a reference.
We got it in.
Movie.
Well, I did want to make one last point before we close, and then we can close. I think you're right, Greg, that he was aware of it in his day. He hated, I don't think he hated Frank Herbert, but he didn't like Dune. In fact, he refused to review it. And he's quoted, like, the words that we have for him are just like he disliked it with intensity. And part of it was because it was kind of a polar opposite to what he was trying to achieve in The Lord of the Rings. And I think that he had started seeing the culture, that there was this trending towards despair, a lack of trust in God, and then essentially taking on new forms of belief that ultimately end us in depression and unhappiness. Anyway, so yeah, if you like what you hear, go ahead and rate us 3 Silmarillions out of 3, just for old time's sake.
3 whole Silmarillions.
Yeah.
Not even Silmarils. We're
not
past
Silmaril.
that.
Yeah, we want 3
more.
copies of the book. Actually, there's
3 stories about the Silmarils.
3 Silmarils out of 3 for old time's sake. Like the actual
Rate us
jewels.
1,000,000 Silmarillions.
Yeah.
A Silmaril millions.
I don't understand why they don't just let us have like a custom rating system.
Yeah.
Yeah, like 3 thumbs up.
And follow us everywhere at Before the Fellowship. Join the Discord discussion and send any comments or questions to beforethefellowship@gmail.com. Join us next week as we read the greatest story you've never heard. We've already read it, The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. Goodbye.